and welcome to Tzutzis Parsha, Sparks and Tidbits of Torah interpretation on the weekly Torah portion. This week is a double portion, another double portion. We just had one 2 weeks ago, the week before that, and this time the double portion is only observed in the diaspora. In Israel, they will be reading the section called Behar by itself, and next week they'll be reading Bechukosai, so that we will catch up with the reading in Israel, because they didn't read the same parshas that we were reading the last few weeks, because we got ahead of them, because they got ahead of us, because the last day of Passover for us, which the Torah reading of a holiday overrides the Torah reading of the weekly parsha. So we were still reading the Passover Torah portion, while they were already reading the next week's Torah portion. So they're a week ahead of us. So in order to catch up, we consolidate. We have two parshas together. At any rate, this week we have the parsha of Behar and Bechukosai. As mentioned in many of the earlier classes, whenever there's a double parsha, it looks as if the two parshas, at least the names of the two parshas, but actually the names and the content, are a paradox. What is the paradox here? Behar means on the mountain. What's the characteristic of a mountain? That it protrudes, it juts out of the earth and rises upward. It's above the surface. What's the parsha that follows? The second parsha that we're going to be reading, Bechukosai, which simply means in my commandments and my statutes. But the root of the word statute, chok, Bechukosai, is related to a word that means engraved. When you engrave something, you're doing the opposite of creating a mountain. A mountain is above the surface. Engraving means deeper into the surface. So without much reflection, just knowing that the two parshas represent the idea of a mountain and the idea of a valley, if you will, it teaches us this twin lesson in Judaism. That in Judaism we have to have both approaches, the mountain approach and the valley approach. The mountain approach is one in which we stand firm and proud, and we assert ourselves, because it's not our own egos that we're talking about, it's our God, it's our Torah, it's our commandments, and that we're not going to shy away from asserting our right and our responsibility to not only observe these commandments, but to do it with pride, with joy, and to not be ashamed of it, to do it in the open. That's Behar, in the mountain. But then, we also have to have, together with that pride, a profound sense of humility, where we see the emptiness within ourselves. Just like when you engrave something, you create a space, an empty space, a vacuum, if you will. We have to recognize that we are essentially empty vessels, receptive to receive that which comes from above. When you put the two together, we have an ideal approach to Judaism. The Torah portion, Behar, begins discussing the laws of the sabbatical year. In Israel, every 7 years, this started from the time the Jews entered into the land of Israel. They were not allowed to work on the earth. They were not allowed to plow, they couldn't sow, they couldn't reap, and you couldn't hoard. Everything that grew in the 7th year was free for anyone to take. For any human, animal, it wasn't yours anymore. It was public property for one entire year. And the Torah goes into quite a lot of details about this particular sabbatical year. And we know that Torah very infrequently speaks about a subject in such great detail. It usually gives it to us in a very general terms. For example, the law of Shabbos, the Sabbath itself, which occurs every week. There's very little in the Torah about it. The Torah repeats the same thing over and over again. On the seventh day you have to rest. And a few other very brief statements that really tell us very little about Shabbos. How do we know how to observe Shabbos? We rely on the oral Torah, that which was transmitted orally. But here, the Torah seems to go into great detail about the sabbatical year. So Rashi explains why. Rashi says that it's to tell you, this is the paradigm for all mitzvahs. Just like this mitzvah was given on Mount Sinai in its very detailed form. How do we know that? Because the parsha begins with those words, and God spoke to Moses on Mount Sinai, saying, and it goes on to talk about the laws of the sabbatical year. So just like the mitzvah of Shemitah, of the sabbatical year, was given at Mount Sinai in its general form and also with its specifics, with every nuance of the law, so too, all of the Torah that was given at Mount Sinai was not just given in a very general form, but was actually given with all of its details. So this is the paradigm for all other mitzvahs. And the question is asked, why did God pick on this mitzvah of all mitzvahs to serve as the paradigm? Could have used any other mitzvah. Could have used Shabbos itself. Why the mitzvah of the sabbatical year is the paradigm? And one explanation is that, in a certain sense, the sabbatical year is unique. Shabbos you have once a week, restricted, true, but the rest of the week you're in control. Here, an entire year, you yield control of that which is so important to you. Your economic status is delivered into the hands of God, and it's free for all. You can't do anything. That total surrender of everything that we have and own, that is something that is the paradigm for all mitzvahs, because every mitzvah is here to instill within us God is the master of the world, and everything we have and everything we do is devoted and dedicated to serving that God, doing everything for Him. There's another interpretation given by the Chassam Sofer, who says that this mitzvah is unique because this mitzvah proves the divinity of the Torah, that it was given at Mount Sinai. We know that there are people who deny that the Torah was given at Mount Sinai, just like there are people who tragically deny that there was ever a King David, or there was ever even a temple in Jerusalem. There are people today who will say that the temple is a myth, just like there are people who deny the Holocaust, which happened in recent history. There's a certain trend, a certain attitude of denial, trying to undermine the foundations of Judaism. It's a form of anti-Semitism, and it's a form of trying to challenge the very foundation of Judaism so that it excuses a person in his or her own mind for not observing the commandments. Why do I have to observe them? It's man-made. But how do we know that it's divine? There are many proofs, and we're not going to go into that. But one of the proofs can be derived from this week's Torah portion. Because if you look a little bit further, after the Torah goes into detail about what we cannot do during this year, in verse 20, it's chapter 25, verse 20, the Torah records a question that people could ask. And this is very unusual. And it says as follows: if you will say, what will we eat in the seventh year? Behold, we will not sow, not gather in our crops. So what are we going to eat? And the answer the Torah gives, I, God, will ordain my blessing for you in the sixth year, and it will yield a crop sufficient for the 3-year period. In other words, when you grow things in the sixth year, you need it for the sixth year. It'll also suffice for the entire seventh year. And since you're not planting in the seventh year, you have nothing to eat in the eighth year except that which was grown in the sixth year. 1 year will be so blessed that it will cover all your needs for 3 years. This is proof no man-made author, no human author will make a promise like this. If the Torah would have said, do it, and if you suffer, too bad, this is what God wants. But to make this promise, to quote the question of the skeptic and to say, this is the way it's going to be, this had to be divine. So the Chassam Sofer says, therefore, the Torah chose this to be the paradigm for all other commandments. Someone asked the question, we just got a message, why was the Torah given on a mountain? What's the symbolism of a mountain? Mountains provide loneliness and isolation. Well, that's true, but you can be isolated in a desert as well, and the Torah was given in a desert. And you can be isolated in your own home. Isolation is a state of mind. When a person feels that he's walking with God and God is with him all the time, that person is never isolated. There's an expression that Chassidim were never lonely. They always sensed that God was with them. They always felt their Rebbe was with them. So isolation is a state of mind, not a reality. Now, why was the Torah given on a mountain? So the sages tell us that it was given on the lowest of mountains. Mount Sinai is the lowest of mountains to teach us humility. But then the question is, if it's to teach us humility, it should have been given in a valley, on a very low place. Why was it given on a mountain? And the answer is, as I mentioned before, that even though we have to be humble, we have to never shy away from asserting our own right, our own privilege, our own obligation to serve God through observing the mitzvahs. And there are times when we have challenges, when there are those who try to undermine our commitment to Jewish values. And they'll use all sorts of arguments. And it's very easy for a person to say, how can I fight with them? Who am I? What am I? I'm a nobody. I'm a nothing. Be very humble. That humility is totally out of place. In times like that, you have to stand firm like a mountain, like a rock of Gibraltar, not to give in to the pressure that we all have. Some people have pressure from other people. Some have pressure from financial circumstances. Some have internal pressures. But the mountain is the symbol of strength. Getting back to why the Torah chose the sabbatical year to serve as the paradigm, because this is the commandment that supports and reinforces the belief that the Torah is divine and was given at Mount Sinai. And that's why it's the model for all other commandments. Then we go on. The Torah speaks about how you're supposed to support those who are poor. Hold on to this person, be strong, give him strength, and let him live with you. Give him life, support him. Metaphorically, this verse is referring to different types of poverty. One form of poverty is financial poverty, and the Torah requires us to give tzedakah to help the person. Help them either by giving them an outright contribution or a loan or any other way we can help them stand on their own 2 feet. That's the simple meaning of tzedakah. But then the Talmud says that poverty is not measured economically. The only true poor person, the Talmud says, is someone who is poor in knowledge. If a person doesn't understand, and we're not talking about book knowledge, we're not talking about that if you don't have a PhD, you're poor. No, PhDs can be very poor intellectually. Poverty in knowledge means that you don't have the awareness of who you are, why you're here, what value you really have. You don't appreciate the fact that you have a neshama, you have a soul, and you are a diamond, precious, special, chosen by God, as if no one else in the world exists except for you. God wants you to be here, and He wants you to accomplish the things that only you can accomplish, whether they're big or small. That's what knowledge means, an awareness, and not just an awareness in the back of your mind, but the word for knowledge in Hebrew, das or dea, means an attachment to that knowledge. You keep on reflecting on it and reinforcing it. That's a rich person, because that's the person who knows who he or she is and why he or she is here. So there are people who don't have that knowledge, unfortunately, for whatever reason. It may not be their fault. So the Torah says if it's your brother, he's poor in knowledge, you have to give him strength. You have to fortify him. Give him purpose and meaning in life. But then there's a third dimension. The ultimate poor person is actually the person who's on the highest spiritual level. Mashiach himself is referred to as Ani, a poor person riding on a donkey. And the metaphor of Mashiach being poor is a symbol of his humility, a symbol that he has nothing, because all that he wants is to bring about the age of redemption. He wants the world to not go through suffering and pain. And as long as they're suffering and pain, he is in pain and suffering. He is the ultimate impoverished person, suffering person, because of all the suffering in the world. So the Torah says when your brother, Mashiach himself, is poor, you have to give him strength. We are going to give Mashiach strength? And the Rebbe says yes, that every one of us has a spark of Mashiach in him or her, and when we awaken that spark, we reveal the general Mashiach, and we bring about redemption. In general, there's an expression cited in many classic texts, Ein melech below am, there is no king without a nation. In order for someone to be a king, he has to have a nation, people who say, long live the king, Yechi HaMelech, long live the king. They give life to the king. Well, the Rebbe says that's true about every king. When you show your commitment to following the dictates of that king, that leader, whoever the leader may be, we're assuming the leader is one who's steeped in Torah and Torah values, you give him strength to be a leader. You empower him to be a leader, because the leader needs the followers. But that's even more true with Mashiach, because every one of us has that spark. So when we ignite our spark, and we try to take away our own poverty, that's how we take away the poverty of Mashiach, who is the Ani, the poor man. And that's what the Torah means, Behar, you shall support him, give him strength. And you do that by saying to him, Yechi HaMelech, may the king live, may he live and be vibrant, so he can take us out of exile. Then the Torah goes on to describe the laws concerning servitude, servants. A Jew is not allowed to sell himself as a servant. Why? Because Avadai, they are my servants. They belong to me, God says. And they're not to be servants of other servants. This is a relatively short parsha, and we're going to go over to Bechukosai, the second parsha that we're going to be reading, in which God promises us that if we follow his commandments, we study Torah, toil in the study of Torah, then God will bless us with all of our needs. There'll be rain in their season, the trees will produce fruit, the grains will grow, all the wild animals will no longer be a threat to us, our enemies will be pursued by us, and everything will be fine and dandy. This is wonderful blessings, and these blessings are followed with the converse. What happens if you don't listen, and God forbid, there will be all these curses. Now, God does not give curses. God gives only blessings. As the Rebbe pointed out, we can take those blessings and trade them in for curses. But in essence, even those curses come from a very holy place, from the divine. That means that we have the power to convert those curses, to transform them back into blessings. But before we go into an example of one of those, Torah here speaks about, I will eliminate the wild beasts. That's in chapter 26, and that is verse 6. I will provide peace in the land, and you will lie down with none to frighten you. I will cause wild beasts to withdraw from the land, and a sword will not cross your land. Now, the Hebrew word that they translate here is to withdraw from the land. Hishbati actually has a stronger translation. The word Hishbati is related to the word Shabbos, Shabbat, arrest, disruption of work. The Torah uses the term when it talks about getting rid of chametz, leavened bread before Passover, tashbisu, destroy, disrupt the existence of chametz for Passover. So over here, it's not just I will withdraw them animals, but I will disrupt them. Now, what does disruption here mean? So there's a dispute in the Midrash between two opinions, Reb Shimon and Reb Yehuda. Reb Yehuda is of the opinion that God in the Messianic age, that this is a promise that this will happen in the Messianic age, that these wild animals will be completely obliterated. They won't exist anymore. I know some kids will be upset that they won't be able to see these animals in a zoo. Maybe they'll just exist in a zoo for us to enjoy, but not in the real world. We won't have to worry about wild animals. They won't exist anymore. That's the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Shimon says, no, they will be around, but they won't be threatening. They won't be harmful to us. Those are two different approaches concerning how evil, because this is also a metaphor. These wild animals, the Rambam says, is a metaphor, or could be interpreted according to the Rambam, as a metaphor for wild and threatening forces in the world. There are two ways you can deal with threatening forces. One way is to completely obliterate them. They don't exist anymore. And the other way is you can tame them and turn them into positive forces. I'll give you an example. There are certain traits that people have that are negative. A person is jealous of another person, and the jealousy causes them to covet, to desire what the other one has. And that can cause, as Maimonides says, for them to try to get them to sell it to them. And when they don't want to sell it, and you keep on persisting and they refuse to sell it, you might steal it from them. And they might put up resistance, and you might even kill them. So the last of the 10 Commandments, which is don't covet that which belongs to your fellow, is a slippery slope that could lead to theft, it could lead to false testimony, it could lead to all sorts of negative consequences, even that which is as serious as murder itself. So there's a terrible trait to be jealous of someone. So you can deal with getting rid of it in two ways. One way is get rid of jealousy. I don't care what anyone else has, what anyone else does. I'm my own person. That other person is his person. Let him or her do whatever he or she does. I am not jealous of anyone, whatever they have. There's no jealousy. And in the Messianic age, there will be no reason for anyone to be jealous of anyone else's resources, property, because everyone will have whatever they want. You won't be in need of anything. If you want a yacht, you'll get a yacht. I don't know if people in the Messianic age will be into yachts, but if they do, they'll get it. If you want a beautiful summer home, you'll have it. A beautiful, expensive car, you'll have it. So there's no one to be jealous of because you'll have whatever you want. But there's another way of looking at it, that jealousy will still remain, but it will be a positive jealousy, in the sense that when I see someone is more kind than myself, I want to be like him or her. I want to be more kind. I see someone is devoting more energy to studying Torah, going more deeply into it. I want to go more deeply into it. When people are on a higher level, it makes us want to follow them and emulate them. It says in Ethics of the Fathers, who is a wise person? Someone who learns from everyone. And the conventional meaning of that is that you learn from people who know less than you. There's something you can learn from everyone. The Rebbe once interpreted this to mean that you can learn and you're a wise person if you do, from people who are much greater than you. What does that mean? Sometimes people say, don't expect me to look up to someone who knows more than me because I'm not that person. I'm satisfied with who I am, and to a certain extent we should be satisfied, and we shouldn't want to be the other person. But on the other hand, that other person sets the bar very high and tells us that we have room to expand, room to grow, room to climb, and we never end growing and climbing and improving and elevating ourselves. So that's a form of jealousy, but it's a very positive form of jealousy, that we're not begrudging someone else's possessions, that we would like to have it instead of them, or we would like to have it ourselves, but we want to grow and go higher and higher. So we can take negative traits, don't get rid of them, get rid of their negative character. Now, as I said, Tochacha has many terrible curses, terrible things that will happen to the Jewish people, and many of them did happen tragically for violating God's commandments. And one of them is one of the most horrific ones, which I'll mention in a moment, but the Hasidic masters have said that all these curses, if you read them in another way, you will see that they are really metaphors and blessings. And it's up to us to look into them, to see the blessings, and to do what we have to do in our own lives to be able to access the deeper meaning, the blessings that are within and beneath the surface. So one of these terrible curses is about how fathers will eat their children. There will be such a famine, such starvation, that the fathers will eat their children. Now, how does one understand that in a positive way? How could you, this is in chapter 26, verse 29, and it reads, you will eat the flesh of your sons and the flesh of your daughters will you eat. Well, based on Hasidic thought, there's a way of understanding that in a very positive way. Parents and children are metaphors for intellect and emotion. We are human beings in possession of both intellect and emotions. The emotions are the product, the children of our intellect. If I understand that something is good for me, then I will want it, I will desire it. If I understand how something is bad for me, I will shun it, I will try to keep away from it. Now, there are several ways a human being could function. One way is you can have your understanding of things. I understand that it's a good thing to study Torah. Then, my feelings, but I like to do other things that are more enjoyable for me. So I have an understanding, and yet my emotions don't follow my understanding. That's one way. Then there's another way that's even worse, where your emotions control your understanding. Your desires are so strong that you can't control yourself, and that your mind doesn't have the ability to sway or influence, inspire at all your emotions, your feelings, to the point where you begin to rationalize, that your mind starts working in favor of the thing that is harmful for you. A person who, let's say, smokes, which is harmful to your health. And at one point you say, I know it's harmful, but I still can't stop doing it. Another person will rationalize it's not even harmful. Because in that case, what happened is their emotions, the children, swallowed up the parents, the intellect. The intellect doesn't have a mind of its own, doesn't have any status, doesn't have any sway, doesn't have any power or influence. That is hinted in the Haggadah. This is the Hasidic interpretation of the opening words of Haggadah. This is the bread of affliction that our fathers ate. And the previous Lubavitch Rebbe translated it. This is the bread of affliction that ate our fathers. Not our fathers ate, but ate our fathers. That means when we lived in Egypt, the impoverishment that we studied, that we experienced, as I mentioned before, impoverishment is not just physical, but it's in terms of knowledge, that their emotions swallowed their fathers, their intellect, their parents were subsumed within them, didn't have any influence, didn't have any power to change them. What's the opposite? The opposite of your children swallowing up the parents, it's when the parents swallow up the children. Meaning, when the intellect is so strong, when your knowledge of what's right and what's wrong, and your awareness of what's right and what's wrong is so powerful that it swallows your emotions. It totally envelops your emotions, that your emotions are completely consistent with your understanding. It doesn't stray, it doesn't take you in a different direction. That's the ultimate blessing. And that's how one could interpret this terrible curse in a very positive way. At the end of the curses, God promises that he will remember the people, the merit of Jacob, the merit of Isaac, and the merit of Abraham. That it's through our patriarchs, through their merit, through their dedication to God, in three different ways. Abraham is known as the paragon of kindness and love. When we adopt Abraham's attitude of love, loving our fellow, reaching out to help someone, when we adopt the virtues of Isaac, Isaac represents prayer, digging deep inside, introspection, refining our hearts to become more sincere, more deeper in our way of serving God, and he is the model of avoda, of service. And then we invoke the merit of Jacob. Jacob represents the ideal of Torah. That Jacob is described as someone who dwells in the tents, referring to the tents of Torah. When we devote ourselves to the teachings of Torah, Jacob also personifies the trait of emet, of truth and consistency. Through those three things, we break away from all these curses and we usher in the complete and ultimate redemption. Just one other point, the very beginning of the parsha Bechukosai starts off with the word if. And the Rebbe, very often when he would quote this verse, he would leave out the word if. He would just say, Bechukosai telecha, you will go in my commandments. Because it's not an if, even though the word if here could be also translated as when, why leave it to different interpretations? Focus on the positive. But even the word im has some positive hints in it. The word im has two letters, an aleph and a mem. And it said that all redemptions that the Jews had came through two people, one whose name begins with an aleph and one whose name begins with a mem. First Exodus was, of course, the one from Egypt. Who were the two leaders that got us out of Egypt? It was Aleph, Aaron, and Mem, Moshe. Those were the two. When it came to the next exile, we were in Persia. We were threatened by Haman's decree. Who got us out of that? It was Aleph, Esther, and Mem, Mordechai. Later on in the story of Hanukkah, when we were threatened by the Syrian Greeks, who got us out of that mess? It started off with a rebellion by Aleph and Mem. Now the Mem is very easy. It's Matisyahu. He was the father of the 5 Maccabees, and he started the rebellion that led to the liberation of the Jewish people from Syrian Greek tyranny. The Aleph stands for one of his sons, which was Elazar. According to Rashi, Elazar was the leader, although most of us have in our memory that Yehuda HaMaccabee was the leader. It seems from Rashi that Elazar was the leader. At any rate, he was one of the Maccabees, Elazar Matisyahu. The final redemption from this exile will be ushered in by 2 individuals as well. One of them is Aleph, Eliyahu, and the other one is Mem, Mashiach. So the word im has a reference to all of the different sources of redemption or liberation. Everyone should have a good evening and a good Shabbos, Shabbat Shalom, and a good week.